"If you go through with this wedding date, don't expect us there," her father said. And that was how Olivia Harper learned that her parents would rather sit on a beach than sit in the front row at her wedding. The words didn't come during a screaming match or a dramatic family dinner. They arrived in a calm phone call on a Tuesday evening while Olivia was reviewing final seating charts at her kitchen table, a half-finished cup of coffee growing cold beside her laptop. She had spent 18 months planning this day with careful precision, touring venues across 3 counties, comparing catering menus down to the price per plate, and mailing invitations to relatives flying in from as far as Oregon and Florida. The date had been secured a year in advance at a restored stone chapel just outside Denver, with a reception to follow at a historic inn overlooking the foothills, deposits paid, contracts signed, and vendors booked solid. When her younger sister Emily mentioned that her long-planned Mediterranean cruise overlapped with the wedding weekend, Olivia assumed it was an unfortunate coincidence. She never imagined it would turn into an ultimatum. Her mother, Margaret, framed it as a simple request at first. "Can't you just move it a few months?" she asked gently over brunch, stirring her tea as if they were discussing weather. "Family comes first." Olivia explained, calmly and clearly, that rescheduling would cost nearly $40,000 in cancellation fees alone. Guests had already booked flights. Her fiancé, Ethan Cole, had coordinated time off from his engineering firm months in advance. The chapel only had 2 available Saturdays that year, and the other had passed. It wasn't stubbornness. It was logistics. But the tone shifted after that. Text messages became shorter. Calls went unanswered. In the family group chat, her parents responded to Emily's vacation countdown posts with enthusiasm while ignoring Olivia's updates about final dress fittings and menu tastings. The silence was deliberate, and Olivia felt it like a draft under a closed door. 3 days before the ceremony, instead of stopping by to help assemble welcome bags as promised, her parents sent an email with the subject line, "We won't be attending." The explanation was brief. Emily's trip had been planned for years. The cruise was non-refundable. They didn't want her to feel unsupported. Olivia read the message twice, then a third time, as if additional sentences might appear. Ethan found her sitting at the dining table, staring at the screen. "It's not about the vacation," he said quietly. And she knew he was right. This wasn't the first time Emily's schedule had dictated family decisions. High school graduation parties had been adjusted around her dance competitions. Holiday dinners had shifted to accommodate her preferences. Olivia had always been the reasonable one, the flexible one, the daughter who understood. Now, as the final week of wedding preparations ticked by, she realized that understanding had become expectation. On the morning of her rehearsal dinner, she walked through the chapel alone, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows onto rows of polished wooden pews. The first row was reserved with small ivory cards printed with her parents' names. She stood there for a long moment, then slid the cards into her purse without saying a word. The ceremony would begin at 4 o'clock on Saturday, whether they were seated there or not. And for the first time in her life, Olivia chose not to rearrange herself to keep the peace. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear it almost felt staged, a soft blue stretching over the foothills as if nothing in the world were out of place. Olivia woke before her alarm, staring at the ceiling of the small suite she had rented at the historic inn, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of early deliveries in the courtyard below. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine that everything was normal, that her mother was down the hall steaming her dress, that her father was rehearsing the short toast he had once promised to give. Then her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A notification from social media lit up the screen. Emily had posted a photo from the deck of a cruise ship, the ocean stretching endlessly behind her, her parents standing on either side, sunglasses on, arms around their younger daughter. The caption read, "Family time at last." Olivia did not zoom in. She did not reread the caption. She simply turned the phone face down and sat up slowly, placing her feet on the carpet as if the room might tilt if she moved too quickly. Downstairs, bridesmaids were already gathering in the reception room, garment bags hanging from hooks, curling irons, heating on long tables covered in white linens. There was laughter, the soft clink of coffee cups, the scent of hairspray and fresh flowers. No one mentioned the empty suite next door that had been reserved for her parents. No one asked whether they were running late. The absence hovered in the room without being named. Ethan arrived mid-morning, dressed in a pressed navy suit, his expression steady. He did not offer false reassurances. He simply took her hands and held them for a long moment, grounding her. "We are still getting married today," he said quietly. It was not a question. At 3:45 in the afternoon, guests began filling the chapel, programs rustling, soft music playing from the string quartet positioned near the altar. Olivia stood at the back in trance with her bouquet of ivory roses, breathing in the faint scent of polished wood and candle wax. The coordinator gave her a small nod. The doors opened. She stepped forward. The first row on the left was filled by Ethan's parents, who rose with warm smiles. The first row on the right remained partially empty, the reserved space unmistakable. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Olivia kept her eyes ahead. Each step down the aisle felt deliberate, measured, not rushed. She did not search the crowd. She did not allow her gaze to drift toward the vacant seats. When she reached the front, she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor and turned toward Ethan, the late afternoon light catching the edge of her veil. The officiant began speaking about commitment, about choosing one another in both ease and difficulty. Olivia listened carefully, aware of the contrast between the words being spoken and the quiet reality behind her. Outside, the mountain stood unchanged, steady and indifferent. Inside, she made her vows without hesitation, her voice clear, her hands steady in Ethan's. Whatever was missing in the pews, she did not let it follow her to the altar. The reception began with the soft glow of string lights woven through the wooden beams of the ballroom, and the low murmur of conversation blending with the steady rhythm of instrumental music. Olivia stood near the edge of the dance floor, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, watching guests mingle beneath the warm amber lighting. From a distance, the evening looked complete. Plates were cleared efficiently. Laughter rose from tables near the windows, and the cake stood tall and untouched beneath a delicate arrangement of fresh flowers. Yet the absence from earlier in the day lingered like a space no decoration could fill. When it was time for the traditional parent dances, the disc jockey paused briefly, glancing at the schedule in his hand. There was a subtle shift in the room, a shared understanding without explanation. Ethan stepped forward and squeezed Olivia's hand, and instead of announcing a father-daughter dance, the music transitioned seamlessly into a slow instrumental chosen for the couple's first dance. They moved together in the center of the room, not dramatically, not hurried, simply steady. Guests circled around them, offering quiet smiles of encouragement. No one mentioned the change in program. No one asked questions. Later, during dinner, Olivia excused herself and stepped out onto the stone terrace overlooking the darkened hills. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. She leaned lightly against the railing, allowing the quiet to settle around her. Her phone vibrated again in her clutch. Another photo notification. This time it was a sunset view from the cruise deck, her parents and Emily silhouetted against a pink horizon. The caption read, "Making memories." Olivia studied the image for only a second before locking her screen. She did not feel anger in that moment. What she felt was clarity. Inside the ballroom, toasts were beginning. Ethan's father spoke warmly about partnership and respect. A college friend recalled the early days of their relationship, describing Olivia's patience and determination. When it was her turn to say a few words, she stood slowly, the room falling quiet. She thanked her guests for traveling miles to be there, for choosing to witness the start of something new. She did not reference who was missing. She did not offer explanations. Her voice remained even, composed, almost reflective. Afterward, as the evening wound down and guests filtered toward the shuttle buses, Olivia removed the small ivory place cards she had carried in her purse since the rehearsal. She walked back into the now quiet chapel, the candles extinguished, petals scattered lightly along the aisle. She set the cards on a side table near the entrance, not as an accusation, but as a closing gesture. Outside, Ethan waited by the car, the headlights casting a soft glow. Against the gravel drive. When she reached him, he did not ask what she had done. He simply opened the passenger door. As they drove away from the chapel, the building growing smaller in the rearview mirror, Olivia realized that some absences speak louder than arguments ever could. And in the quiet of that realization, something inside her shifted from disappointment to resolve. The first week of marriage unfolded with an unexpected quiet, not the peaceful kind that follows celebration, but the kind that settles after a door has been firmly closed. Olivia and Ethan returned from their short honeymoon in Santa Fe to a stack of unopened mail and a dining table, still holding a few stray wedding favors they had not yet put away. The house felt new in a different way now, not just because of shared closet space and framed photographs waiting to be hung, but because of what had been left behind at the chapel. On the third morning back, Olivia's phone rang while she was pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The name on the screen read Margaret. She let it ring twice before answering. Her mother's voice sounded light, almost casual, as if commenting on the weather. "We saw the pictures online," she said. "It looked nice." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the empty seats. Olivia responded evenly, thanking her for calling, describing the weather, mentioning how the mountains had glowed gold in the late afternoon sun. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, the kitchen felt smaller. Later that day, a package arrived containing a folded card and a check made out for what her parents would have contributed toward the wedding. The note read, "We hope this helps." The handwriting was familiar, steady, careful. Olivia held the paper for a long moment before setting it down on the counter. Ethan watched her quietly. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, the card resting loosely in her hands. Her mind drifted backward through years of similar moments, each one subtle on its own, but clearer now in sequence. The time her college graduation dinner had been postponed because Emily had a last-minute rehearsal. The Christmas morning when gifts were opened early so that her sister could leave for a ski trip. The steady pattern of accommodation that had shaped her into the flexible daughter, the one who adjusted plans without protest. That evening, Olivia placed the unopened check back into the envelope and slid it into a drawer of her desk. She did not deposit it. She did not tear it up. She simply let it sit there, unresolved. Over the next few days, extended relatives began calling, some offering congratulations, others carefully probing for details about why her parents had not attended. Olivia kept her answers simple. They had other plans, she would say. She did not elaborate. Each time she repeated the phrase, it grew lighter on her tongue, less charged. On Sunday afternoon, as she and Ethan unpacked the last of their suitcases, another message appeared on her phone, this time from her father. It read, "We should all sit down soon and talk." Olivia stared at the words, feeling neither urgency nor dread. For the first time, she understood that any conversation would not be about repairing what had happened at the chapel. It would be about whether she was willing to return to the role she had quietly played for years. She set the phone aside without replying. Outside the window, the late summer sun dipped slowly behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. In that quiet house, surrounded by unpacked boxes and wedding photographs waiting to be framed, Olivia recognized that absence had forced a decision she might never have made on her own. And she was not certain she was ready to give that decision back. The invitation to meet arrived the following Thursday in the form of a short text message from her father, asking if they could come by on Saturday afternoon to talk things through. Olivia read it while sitting at her desk at work, the steady hum of office printers and quiet conversations surrounding her. She did not feel a rush of nerves this time. She simply forwarded the message to Ethan with a single line that read, "They want to talk." On Saturday, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes colors look muted and softer than usual. Margaret and Richard arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, standing on the porch with a store-bought pie balanced between them, as if this were an ordinary family visit. Olivia opened the door and stepped aside, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. They sat in the living room, hands folded neatly in their laps, glancing occasionally at the framed wedding photograph that now hung above the fireplace. No one mentioned the empty seats in that picture. Margaret began carefully, explaining how difficult it had been to choose between daughters, how they had felt torn, how they had hoped Olivia would understand the financial commitment of Emily's trip. Richard added that family unity required flexibility. Olivia listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her breathing even. When they finished, she spoke quietly, choosing each word with care. She explained that the date had never been about stubbornness. It had been about honoring a commitment she and Ethan had made long before the cruise was planned. She told them that what hurt was not their vacation, but the silence, the email, the public photographs posted during the ceremony. Margaret shifted in her seat and said they had not meant for it to appear intentional. Olivia nodded slightly, but did not soften her tone. She asked a simple question instead. If the situation were reversed, would you have expected Emily to move her wedding? The room fell silent. Richard looked down at his hands. Margaret hesitated, then admitted quietly that they probably would not have asked her to change it. The honesty settled heavily in the space between them. Olivia felt something steady inside her, not anger, not triumph, just recognition. For years she had accepted being the reasonable one, the daughter who adjusted her plans to keep peace. That role no longer fit. She told them she loved them, but she would not continue reshaping her life around decisions made for someone else's comfort. There were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Only a calm boundary drawn clearly and without apology. When the conversation ended, Margaret offered the pie again, as if dessert might smooth what words could not. Olivia thanked her and placed it in the refrigerator. Richard paused at the door before leaving and said they would try to do better. Olivia did not respond with reassurance. She simply wished them a safe drive home. After they left, she stood in the quiet living room, the faint scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. Ethan joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She did not feel victorious. She felt grounded. For the first time, the conversation had not revolved around accommodating someone else. It had centered on what she needed. And in that shift, something long unsettled finally began to steady. The days following that conversation did not transform everything overnight, but they altered the rhythm of communication in subtle ways. Margaret began sending occasional messages that were shorter and less directive, asking how work was going or whether the garden in Olivia's backyard had survived the early frost. Richard called one Sunday afternoon to ask about Ethan's new project at the engineering firm, his tone cautious, as if stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Olivia responded politely, never cold, never overly warm. She did not volunteer extra details. She did not fill silences the way she once had. She allowed pauses to exist without rushing to repair them. A week later, Emily returned from her cruise and posted a series of carefully curated photographs online, each one bright and edited, full of clear water and coordinated outfits. She sent Olivia a brief message that read, "I heard you were upset. I hope we can move past this." There was no mention of the ceremony, no acknowledgement of the empty pew. Olivia read the message while sitting at the kitchen counter, sunlight spilling across the granite surface in thin lines. She typed a simple response. "I was not upset about the trip. I was disappointed about the priorities." She pressed send and placed the phone face down. That evening, Ethan found her trimming fresh herbs by the sink, the quiet scrape of the knife steady and measured. "How do you feel?" he asked. Olivia paused before answering. She considered the question carefully, turning it over like a small stone. "Clear," she said finally. It surprised her how accurate that felt. She was not waiting for a grand apology anymore. She was not rehearsing speeches in her head. She had stated what needed to be said. Whether it changed anything on their end was no longer something she could control. 2 weeks later, Margaret invited them to Sunday dinner. The invitation felt almost formal, sent by text rather than assumed, as it once had been. Olivia accepted, not out of obligation, but curiosity. The house she had grown up in looked the same, white siding, blue shutters, the familiar creak of the front step. Inside, the dining table was set neatly, candles placed at even intervals. Conversation moved cautiously at first, skimming safe topics like work schedules and neighborhood updates. Emily mentioned her cruise again, describing the ocean in broad strokes, as if waiting for a reaction. Olivia listened without comment. When dessert was served, Richard cleared his throat and said quietly that he regretted how things had unfolded that weekend. It was not a dramatic confession. It was a measured admission. Margaret nodded in agreement. Olivia did not rush to absolve them. She simply said she appreciated hearing that. The air shifted slightly, not lighter, but more honest. As she and Ethan drove home that night, the streetlights passing in steady intervals along the highway, Olivia realized that change rarely arrives with applause. It comes in small adjustments, in sentences spoken without defensiveness, in boundaries respected without negotiation. She rested her hand on Ethan's arm and watched the dark outline of the mountains against the sky. Whatever shape her relationship with her family would take from here, it would not be built on silent accommodation. It would be built on clarity, or not at all. Autumn settled in gradually, bringing cooler mornings and a shift in routine that felt both familiar and newly defined. Olivia noticed the change in small ways, like the way her parents now waited for her to confirm plans rather than assuming she would adjust her schedule. When Margaret invited her to a charity luncheon in early October, she added, "Only if it works for you." The phrasing was simple, but it carried weight. Olivia checked her calendar and declined because she and Ethan had already planned a weekend trip to the mountains. There was no argument, no subtle guilt woven into the reply. Margaret responded with, "Another time then." It was not dramatic, but it was different. Emily, however, struggled more with the new dynamic. During a family dinner later that month, she joked lightly about how Olivia had always been the dependable one, the sister who never made things complicated. The comment floated across the table with a laugh, as if harmless. Olivia set down her fork and met her sister's eyes calmly. "I was dependable," she said evenly. "That does not mean I was supposed to be flexible every time." The room grew quiet, not tense, but thoughtful. Richard shifted in his chair. Margaret reached for her water glass. Emily looked surprised, then slightly defensive, but she did not push further. The evening continued without raised voices. Later, as dishes were cleared and coats were gathered from the hallway closet, Margaret touched Olivia's arm gently and said she had not realized how often they had expected her to compromise. It was not a full confession, but it was acknowledgement. On the drive home, Ethan glanced over and said he was proud of how she had handled it. Olivia stared out at the passing streetlights, considering how natural it had felt to speak without apologizing. The following week, Olivia received a call from a distant cousin who had attended the wedding. The cousin mentioned how beautiful the ceremony had been and how strong Olivia had looked walking down the aisle. The compliment lingered longer than she expected. Strength had not been something she consciously aimed for that day. She had simply refused to shrink. As Thanksgiving approached, plans were discussed carefully, this time around a group text that included everyone equally. Olivia suggested hosting at her home. There was a pause before Margaret agreed. The day arrived with crisp air and the smell of roasted turkey filling the kitchen. When her parents stepped inside carrying side dishes, they complimented the table setting, the small details, the framed wedding photograph, now placed prominently on the entryway table. No one avoided looking at it. During dinner, conversation flowed more naturally than it had in months. Emily mentioned a new project at work and asked Olivia's opinion without sarcasm or comparison. It was a subtle shift, but Olivia noticed it. She did not mistake progress for perfection. She understood that patterns formed over years would not disappear overnight. But she also understood that something fundamental had changed the moment she stopped rearranging herself for approval. As guests prepared to leave that evening, Margaret hugged her tightly and whispered, "Thank you for hosting." Olivia returned the embrace, not out of obligation, but choice. The house grew quiet after the door closed, the faint echo of laughter still lingering in the air. Standing in the kitchen beside Ethan, she realized that boundaries had not destroyed her family. They had redefined it. And in that redefinition, she felt steadier than she ever had before. Winter arrived with a quiet steadiness that mirrored the new rhythm in Olivia's life. The mornings colder now, frost gathering along the edges of the backyard fence as she wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee before work. The holidays passed without tension, not because everything had been erased, but because expectations had been reset. When Margaret asked in early January whether Olivia would consider joining a short family weekend at a cabin in the mountains, she framed it as an invitation rather than an assumption. Olivia looked at the calendar pinned near the refrigerator and took her time before responding. She agreed, but only for one night, explaining that she and Ethan had already committed to hosting friends on Sunday. The response was accepted without resistance. At the cabin, snow fell lightly outside the windows while a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Conversation flowed easily at first, touching on safe topics like work projects and travel plans. Later that evening, as they gathered around the dining table with cups of hot cocoa, Richard cleared his throat and spoke in a measured tone. He said he had been thinking about that weekend months ago and how easily pride and habit had guided his decisions. He admitted that he had assumed Olivia would eventually give in, because she always had before. The honesty was not dramatic. It was quiet and unembellished. Olivia listened, her posture relaxed, her expression thoughtful. She did not rush to reassure him. Instead, she acknowledged that patterns are comfortable until they are challenged. Margaret nodded slowly, adding that she had confused keeping peace with keeping balance. Emily, sitting across from them, stared down at her cup before speaking. She said she had not realized how often things had tilted in her favor simply because she had asked. The words hung in the air, fragile but sincere. Olivia felt the weight of the moment without letting it overwhelm her. She told them she did not expect perfection. She expected awareness. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the cabin walls, a reminder of how quiet strength often works. The next morning, sunlight reflected sharply off the snow, bright enough to make everyone squint as they stepped onto the porch. Olivia stood for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, noticing how different the silence felt compared to the one that had filled the chapel months earlier. This silence was not empty. It was reflective. On the drive home with Ethan, winding roads cutting through snow-covered trees, she realized that the absence at her ceremony had forced a necessary conversation none of them would have chosen voluntarily. It had exposed an imbalance that had been invisible because it was familiar. Now, as the mountains faded behind them and the city skyline came into view, Olivia did not feel the need to revisit that day again and again. It had become a turning point rather than a wound. She rested her hand on the dashboard, watching sunlight flicker through the windshield, aware that her family might never be perfect, but it no longer required her to disappear for it to function. And that quiet understanding was enough. Spring arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if the season itself understood that change does not always need to announce itself loudly. The snow melted from the edges of the sidewalks, and small green shoots pushed through the soil in Olivia and Ethan's backyard. On a Saturday morning in early April, Olivia knelt in the garden wearing worn gloves and a faded sweatshirt, pressing new seeds into the earth with steady hands. She liked the predictability of it. You plant, you water, you wait. Not everything grows immediately, but effort matters. Her phone buzzed on the patio table nearby. It was a group message from Margaret suggesting a family brunch for Mother's Day. The tone was careful, almost respectful. Let us know what works for you, it read. Olivia wiped her hands on a towel before replying that she and Ethan could attend from 10 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, but they had plans afterward. There was no pushback, only confirmation. At brunch, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. Sunlight streamed through the restaurant windows, casting bright reflections across the polished tables. Richard asked Ethan thoughtful questions about work. Margaret complimented Olivia's new haircut without comparing it to anyone else. Emily spoke about a recent promotion and, for once, did not frame her accomplishments in competition. There were still moments of awkwardness, brief pauses where old habits seemed ready to reappear, but they passed without escalation. After the meal, as they stood outside in the parking lot beneath a clear blue sky, Margaret hugged Olivia and said quietly, "Thank you for giving us another chance." Olivia held her mother for a moment before stepping back. "I am giving us a healthier one," she replied. The distinction was subtle but intentional. Later that evening, Olivia and Ethan sat on their back porch watching the sun dip below the rooftops, the air warm enough to leave the door open behind them. Ethan asked if she felt different now than she had on the night they left the chapel months earlier. Olivia thought about the empty seats, the photographs from the cruise, the conversations that followed. "I feel less responsible for everyone else's comfort," she said slowly. It was not bitterness. It was relief. In the weeks that followed, small confirmations reinforced that shift. When Emily planned a birthday dinner for herself, she checked with Olivia's schedule first. When Richard suggested a summer trip, he asked for input instead of announcing a date. These gestures were not grand apologies. They were adjustments. Olivia understood that respect is often measured not in speeches, but in changed behavior. One evening, as she sorted through old paperwork in her home office, she found the envelope containing the wedding contribution check still tucked inside a drawer. She held it briefly, then carried it downstairs and placed it on the kitchen counter. Ethan looked at her questioningly. "It does not need to stay there anymore," she said, tearing the check in half before dropping it into the trash. It was not about the money. It was about closure. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, light from the overhead fixture casting soft shadows on the cabinets, Olivia realized that what had once felt like rejection had ultimately become clarity. Her family was not perfect, but she was no longer willing to disappear to maintain it. And in that steady refusal, she had finally found her balance. Summer unfolded with longer evenings and a warmth that lingered well past 8 o'clock, casting a golden glow across the neighborhood streets as Olivia and Ethan settled into their routines. Nearly a year had passed since the ceremony, and the date approached again quietly, marked only by a reminder on Olivia's calendar that she did not immediately dismiss. She noticed it while reviewing a work presentation late one evening, the small notification blinking in the corner of her screen. Instead of feeling a familiar tightening in her chest, she simply closed the laptop and stepped outside onto the porch. The air carried the faint scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. Ethan joined her with 2 glasses of iced tea, handing one over without a word. "It has been almost a year," he said gently. Olivia nodded. The memory of that day no longer replayed with sharp edges. It had softened, reshaped by conversations and choices made afterward. A few days later, Margaret called to ask whether they would like to come over for dinner that weekend. There was no specific occasion attached to the invitation, just an open suggestion. Olivia hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. At the house, the atmosphere felt steady, almost familiar in a healthier way. Richard showed Ethan a new set of tools he had purchased for a small renovation project. Margaret asked Olivia about the herbs growing in her backyard and listened attentively as she described which ones had thrived and which had not. During dinner, Emily mentioned that she had been thinking about how quickly assumptions can become habits. She said it without defensiveness, almost thoughtfully. Olivia met her gaze and offered a small nod. "They can," she replied. "But habits can change." The comment was not confrontational. It was factual. Later that evening, as dishes were stacked neatly in the sink and chairs pushed back into place, Richard paused near the doorway. "We missed something important last year," he said quietly. "We do not want to miss more." The words were simple, but they carried sincerity. Olivia felt the weight of them settle, not as pressure, but as acknowledgement. On the drive home, streetlights flickered past in measured intervals, illuminating the road in brief flashes. Ethan reached over and intertwined his fingers with hers. "Do you feel like it was worth holding your ground?" he asked. Olivia considered the question carefully. Holding her ground had not been about winning. It had been about stepping out of a pattern that no longer fit. "Yes," she said finally, because it changed the conversation. In the weeks that followed, small confirmations continued to appear. Invitations were collaborative. Decisions were discussed rather than dictated. When a family vacation was proposed for late summer, dates were compared openly, schedules respected equally. Olivia contributed her availability without apology. As the anniversary of the ceremony arrived, she and Ethan chose to spend the day hiking in the foothills where wildflowers still dotted the trails. At the summit, looking out over the city skyline shimmering in the heat, Olivia felt no lingering resentment. The absence that once defined that day had been replaced by something steadier. It had become the moment she stopped adjusting herself to preserve comfort. And in doing so, she had not fractured her family. She had rebalanced it. Standing there beneath the wide Colorado sky, she understood that sometimes the most important commitment is not only the one made at an altar, but the one made quietly to oneself. By late August, the air carried that subtle hint of change that signals summer is loosening its grip, the evenings cooling just enough to open the windows and let the breeze move through the house. Olivia found herself reflecting less on what had happened and more on what had shifted since then. The difference was not loud or dramatic. It was woven into ordinary moments. When Margaret called now, she asked questions without layering them with expectation. When Richard suggested plans, he waited for confirmation instead of assuming compliance. Even Emily, who once moved through conversations with casual certainty, seemed more deliberate in her words. One Saturday afternoon, Olivia invited her parents over to see the small vegetable patch she and Ethan had expanded in the backyard. Tomatoes hung heavy on the vines, basil growing thick and fragrant along the edges. Margaret walked slowly between the rows, genuinely curious, asking how often Olivia watered them and whether the soil had needed special treatment. Richard commented on the fence Ethan had reinforced earlier in the summer, nodding with quiet approval. The visit felt easy, not because tension had never existed, but because it was no longer hidden. Later, as they sat around the patio table with iced lemonade sweating in tall glasses, Emily arrived carrying a homemade dessert. She set it down carefully and said she had tried a new recipe. There was no competitive undertone, no subtle comparison, just an offering. Conversation drifted naturally, touching on work, travel, and plans for the upcoming holidays. At one point, Margaret mentioned that she had been thinking about how quickly life can change in a single weekend. She did not specify which one. She did not need to. Olivia met her eyes and understood. Sometimes it has to, she replied gently. The acknowledgement did not reopen wounds. It confirmed growth. As the afternoon light stretched longer across the lawn, Ethan joined the group after finishing a phone call. He listened more than he spoke, observing the dynamic with quiet attentiveness. On the drive home later that evening, after walking her parents to their car, Olivia felt a steady calm settle in her chest. She was not monitoring every word anymore. She was not bracing for disappointment. She was simply present. That night, as she folded laundry in the bedroom, she paused to look at the framed photograph from the ceremony hanging above the dresser. The image still held the memory of absence, but it no longer defined the story. It marked the point where she chose clarity over comfort. When Richard called the following week to ask if she and Ethan would like to host Christmas together this year, he added, "Only if it feels right." Olivia smiled softly before answering. "It does," she said. In that simple exchange, she recognized how far they had come. Respect had replaced assumption. Conversation had replaced silence. The balance was not perfect, but it was real. And as the season edged closer to autumn once more, Olivia understood that what began as disappointment had quietly become a foundation. Not just for her marriage, but for a family dynamic rebuilt on something steadier than habit. It was built on choice. By the time the first snow of December dusted the rooftops, the house felt different in a way Olivia could not have imagined a year earlier. The dining room table was extended, extra chairs borrowed from neighbors, the scent of pine from a freshly cut tree filling the air. She moved through the kitchen with steady confidence, basting the turkey, checking the timer, adjusting the heat beneath a pot of simmering cranberries. Ethan set out plates carefully, aligning them with quiet precision. This year, the gathering was not defined by who might not appear. It was shaped by who chose to be present. When the doorbell rang, Margaret and Richard stepped inside carrying wrapped gifts and a tray of warm rolls. Their smiles were not exaggerated. They were genuine, almost grateful. Emily followed behind them with a small bouquet of winter flowers, handing them to Olivia without commentary. The evening unfolded with conversation that felt unforced. Richard complimented the way Olivia had arranged the table, noting the small handwritten place cards at each setting. Margaret asked Ethan about his latest project and listened attentively. Emily volunteered to help clear plates without being prompted. These were not grand gestures. They were quiet corrections. At one point, as snow fell softly beyond the window and laughter drifted across the room, Richard raised his glass and offered a simple toast. He spoke about growth, about learning when to step back, about how families evolve when they are willing to listen. He did not mention specific events. He did not need to. Olivia met his gaze and felt the weight of the words without discomfort. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the guests began pulling on coats near the door, Margaret lingered for a moment. "We are proud of the way you handled everything this year," she said softly. There was no defensiveness in her tone, only respect. Olivia nodded once. "I am proud of us for adjusting," she replied. After the door closed and the house grew quiet again, Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. "It feels different," he said. Olivia looked around the room, at the empty plates, the soft glow of lights reflecting off ornaments, the photograph from their ceremony now surrounded by newer frames capturing holidays and hikes and ordinary afternoons. "It is," she answered. The absence that once echoed through a chapel had become a lesson that reshaped more than a single day. It reshaped expectations. It reshaped communication. It reshaped her own understanding of where she stood. She no longer adjusted herself to avoid discomfort. She stood steady and allowed others to meet her there. Outside, snow continued to fall in quiet layers, covering the ground evenly, without preference. Olivia turned off the kitchen lights and paused for a moment in the stillness. The year had not erased what happened. It had reframed it. What once felt like rejection had become the moment she chose clarity over compliance. And in choosing herself, she did not lose her family. She invited them to rise to a higher standard. This time they did.